us for the IIC's annual Washington, D.C. conference, session 3. My name is Madeleine Lottenbach. I will be moderating the panel, and we are looking at the Restart Agenda, evolution of communications infrastructure to maximize resilience and flexibility, in particular, looking at implications for policymaking and regulation. I think this is an absolutely phenomenal topic. It spans on a wide array of matters ranging from 5G, open radio access networks, standards, ICT supply chain, spectrum policy issues, and more. We're going to begin session 3 today with a look ahead at what's to come in communications infrastructure. I'm joined by Shawn Hakl, partner 5G strategy at Microsoft, who will begin with a presentation on the coming wave of innovation enabled through software virtualization of networks and cloud services that support 5G. Following his presentation, I will have the opportunity to introduce our panel of experts from government and industry alike. We'll get to hear some thoughts from them and continue to discuss not only the evolution of communications infrastructure, but also how to deploy resilient yet flexible safeguards. Sort of as a housekeeping matter, everyone will have the opportunity, as they did on prior panels, to submit questions via the Q&A function. I will check these regularly, and all panelists will have an opportunity to answer them. So please forward along your questions. With that, I will go ahead and turn the microphone over to you, Shawn, to walk us through the cloudification of communications networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and looking forward to hearing what the panel has to say. Some great speakers today. So I thought I'd start off today with maybe just level setting a little bit about the state of where cloudification of the network lies, and give you a feel for where the industry is, both a perspective from the operator side as well as what the hyperscalers are doing in this space. Why the hype? Why are people interested, and why in particular is Microsoft interested? And we really see 5G creating a number of extremely exciting opportunities. It's really creates the opportunity for the first time for a true intersection of the virtual and the physical world. In that regard, sort of we view it as 5G coming together with edge compute creates the ability to provide a ubiquitous compute, allowing you to have compute where you need it, when you need it, wherever you are. That leads into a very interesting possibility of bringing the power of AI and ML insights into the real world. So by having the combination of low latency, the ability to see and respond to actions at a low latency level lets you bring together the power of both the ability to see events in the real world and then the time for you to react to them and be able to take real-time action. So previously, people were limited to sort of just maybe watching and deciding next time. So it's an opportunity to bring the power of AI and ML into the real world. And then finally, we see this ushering in the next age of connected experience. We've seen in the last several months, decades worth of digital transformation just garnered by circumstances, and we see that extending onwards. So the combination of what 5G enables with its, along with edge computing, along with sort of some of the other technologies surrounding it, things like mixed reality, will create that next generation of connected experience, whether it be mixed reality, virtual reality, or just a different type of interconnection. That's what we see. And that's not coming from guesses, and I'm sure many of you have heard the hype around 5G, but it really comes from the patterns we're seeing that evolve out of the several billion IoT devices we already have deployed, and the fact that we're seeing just a surge in the adoption of cognitive services and machine learning experiments on the Microsoft platform. So these are the trends that we see really emerging that are unlocked by the technology. Couple that with kind of what's happening on the operator side of the business. Microsoft views our partner as the operator community as natural partners, because if you think about it, in an always-on 7x24 connected world, your ability to go from your mobile to the cloud, the ability to go from that IoT device to a service based in the cloud, all transits a carrier's network. So we have a shared interest in making sure those experiences with the end customer, whether it be a consumer or an enterprise or a government, be as secure and as resilient and as simple as possible. And we see a lot of things the operators are doing right now to disrupt the way they work. 5G ushers in sort of a new opportunity to drive technology, disrupt and to deliver new experiences to customers. It also is forcing the operators to look at the way they deliver service now and to be able to scale up to meet that demand. So we see them attempting to work on simplifying their overall infrastructure and really take advantage of going more digital, right? Driving taking out the cost of service by driving more digital channel adoption, their ability to personalize and deliver personalized experience to the end users, and really using the power of AI to drive out cost in their business processes. On the other hand, we're also seeing the operators trying to capitalize on the massive investment they're making in 5G, right? You're not just putting all this capital on the ground or in the air to simply deliver the same service at a slightly different price point. There's also a desire to unlock the value, and the operators have some unique intellectual property capabilities and physical assets that'll differentiate them in the 5G world. Some of that being the fact that they are located one hop off the network as close to the customer as you can get. So they're taking to take advantage of that low latency edge compute. We see them trying to create signature customer experiences across these networks to highlight the value of 5G. And then finally, we really see this as an opportunity to truly unlock the power of IoT, not just for consumer devices, but increasingly what we see there is for industrial devices. So this is actually enters into the age of not just information technology, but operations technology, the ability to wire the factory floor, to wire the plant floor with capabilities that would normally exist in the back office. And then finally, this is all just about future-proofing their network, driving forward with their digital transformation agenda, and using the power of automation to scale the business. It's a very, very different proposition to connect millions of subscribers versus billions of devices. And they're going to have to find new ways to securely and simply onboard all of those assets to truly take advantage of the capabilities they've created. Network slicing, which is the ability to divide up the network to process different use cases and provide a different response characteristic and a different price point with a network that's more suited to sort of what I'll call the marginal cases. So it's not just consumer internet, but being able to optimize the response of the network for highly demanding industrial applications, or being able to sliver off part of the network to deal with sort of very, very small devices in large scale. It becomes possible with the next generation of technology. And it's really bringing that together and both from a commercial model and a technical model to unleash the possibilities that creates is the exciting part of 5G. A lot of questions we get is how people see this technology coming together. 5G itself, the reason there's so much energy around it and edge compute is both the physical characteristics of the fact that a lot more compute gets deployed in the operator's network itself, and it's natural to say, how do you extend that to provide end user services as well? Also, 5G itself is based on a set of technology principles that are very cloud friendly. So we get asked a lot about how we see the hyperscaler and the operators coming together. And as I've already talked about, we see this as an opportunity for us to work with the operators to future-proof their network, taking out cost and opening up these new revenue opportunities. Key thing here is we still view this as a partnership. You know, the operator will continue to own the customer, they'll continue to own the brand. Really, essentially, it's their customer, it's their product powered by our technology. We're fundamentally interested in remaining a platform business, right? We're not interested in entering the telecom business. It's more about the focus of taking workloads that have run traditionally on vendor proprietary, vertically integrated stack, much the way enterprise IT used to work, and moving it into the cloud in order to apply cloud economics, to bring down the cost and increase the flexibility of providing that service at scale. And to do that, we've had to change the definition of cloud. People tend to traditionally think of cloud as being a large centralized deployment. In fact, what happens is the power of moving the platform itself with common lifecycle management for the assets, for security, for orchestration, and for DevOps, the ability to deploy code quickly wherever it is, applies whether it's on the premises of the enterprise, applies whether it's the edge of the network or in the cloud itself. We've changed the definition of cloud to stretch out across that, hence the excitement of being able to use the same tools that have made people productive in the enterprise space, also solving some of the problems for the operators. The key thing here is to recognize that the telco ecosystem is incredibly complex. I think they're going to talk about sort of supply chain validation and verification later in the panel. We recognize this. We recognize that the ecosystem has to come together, whether it be with the cloud providers, the folks that provide the RAN, the core network, the network functions, as well as the systems, the operational and business support systems that surround it, are all part of the discussion and have to be supported. So we want to, you know, by working closely with that, you can create the environment of integration and innovation that are necessary to help the whole industry move forward. And finally, this is not a transformation that's going to take place overnight. It's not like poof, you pull an Ethernet cord out of the radio access network and pop it in the cloud, and boom, you're ready to go now. We know that the operators will have to transform at a pace that makes sense for their business. They're not going to change for technology's sake. We have to bring real business value. So driving out cost, increasing digital penetration, and driving new revenue streams are going to what sits behind doing this. Doing the transformation to 5G. There has to be a business point behind it. So just want to give folks a quick, not going to go through a ton of architecture today and explode anyone's head, but just to give you an idea of what is out there for capabilities. We sort of see three models evolving in terms of cloud adoption and with the mobile network. At the first level is where we are today, which is essentially where we've got software-enabled services. That means traditionally what's happening is we're seeing services that were done in hardware in the core of the network are now virtualizing into software. And moving into virtualized software implementations, typically an in-house cloud implementation. And then we also see increasingly the announcements, and you'll see a slew of them lately, with people announcing the presence of edge compute at the enterprise site or at the edge of the network. So essentially what's happening there is you take a cloud presence, in other words, the capability to operate the cloud, and put it at the very edge of the network. So essentially it goes one hop off the network. It comes off the cell phone network and straight to the cloud, very localized. What that gives enterprises and consumers is the operator experience the lowest possible latency compute. In other words, the shortest possible distance. There's also the advantage of privacy and security insofar as that AI and ML can be localized to run there. So you don't have the possibility of data escaping and going where it shouldn't. You've got the ability to provide a more private and more secure experience. There's a series of opportunities that are created by doing this that people find quite exciting. On the virtualization side, in the core of the network, operators are typically doing that in concert with an automation effort to apply the power of AI and ML to automate and simplify their business in the back office. What we're seeing now is that's sort of the state of the nation as it is now and for the last year or two. What we're seeing in our very largest customers is the fact that more and more stuff is actually moving out of their hardware-based appliances into the public cloud itself. So there's a series of features and functions in the network, things like voice and messaging, and to some extent the control plane functions, the pieces, the brains that actually control the network, can naturally evolve to take advantage of cloud economics. And we're starting to see those functions migrate to the public cloud. And what I think you're going to see evolving forward off of that is the deployments of edge compute are going to get more sophisticated, as well as the cloud itself will become, quote, more carrier grade, implementing the security, the resilience features that are necessary to support carrier workloads at scale. And as a result, I think you're increasingly going to see additional functions, more of the control plane centralized, more of the voice. Of the functions that can centralize, just like they did in enterprise IT, will centralize because they're easier to operate and cheaper to operate. At the same time, you're going to see a surge of compute at the edge of the network. And in concert, again, I believe today we're going to talk about Open RAN. Open RAN itself starts to disaggregate the radio access network, allowing you to move certain functions to a more cloud-based function, some of them centralized, which makes them easier and cheaper to deploy. As a result, in the next 6 to 18 months, I think you're going to see more people start to adopt cloud at the edge. You've seen announcements with ourselves with folks like AT&T, where we've announced edge zones with carrier, where we're deploying a presence of Microsoft Azure presence combined with an AT&T, with the AT&T cell phone network at the edge of the network in cities like Los Angeles and Dallas, where again, that processing can start to take place. And so you see more and more of the network become cloudified. Now, does that mean it all is run with Microsoft first-party hardware or first-party software? Absolutely not. This is an ecosystem play. I know my friends from Ericsson are on the phone, and we've made announcements with other folks like Samsung. They all have incredibly valuable software assets that will continue to remain relevant, and all we're essentially doing is changing the technical medium or the technical environments delivered in to be more flexible and more scalable. And I think that's going to be an exciting evolution because I worked at an operator for 20 plus years. I know the power that software can bring to the network to deliver new services, to drive a more secure experience, and to increase that time to market makes it all very, very exciting. So with that, I'll just offer sort of as a closeout, sort of as you see, Microsoft has made a number of announcements in this space recently, along with some acquisitions. So we announced the acquisition of a company called Metaswitch and another company called Affirmed Networks. Both of these provide the intelligence in the network to provide software. Both the intelligence network to control the data network, as well as the intelligence in the network to provide voice and the collaboration applications that sit on top of that. More importantly, they bring in hundreds of engineers that understand telco needs and can be used to change the cloud itself to be more carrier friendly. So implementing the features for security, for observability, for control that the operators need to be comfortable putting network workloads in the cloud itself. So that's, and similarly, they are also experts at building out and have some of the early wins, particularly at Affirm, but also our friends at Metaswitch have a packet core that can run at the edge of the networks, at the enterprise site. So it's the ability to create that control localized for the enterprise, still using operator spectrum and still partnering with the operator, but to deliver that experience on a wireless basis at the edge of the enterprise network. So if you think about it, for us to make that picture I just showed you possible, we have an interconnect layer that lets us deeply interconnect with carriers around the globe. We have our own global backbone for data center to data center traffic. By partnering closely with the operators today, we have more than 500 operators connected to us with over 20,000 peering points. We have more than 200 customers that direct connect via something called Express Route straight into the cloud. This just gives us the possibility to bring the network and the cloud together. We then, as I mentioned earlier, create the cloud form factor that is necessary to present the cloud where it's needed, whether that be at the edge of the enterprise, the edge of the network, or at the edge of the cloud, so that the operators can choose where they want to intersect and adopt cloud technology. And then finally, on top of that, we put a mix of both first-party and third-party software assets. As I said, well, we have our own first-party software assets. We're no interest in becoming a vertically integrated supplier. So the sign of a healthy ecosystem is to have a great partner network running on top of that. And you may have seen announcements with folks like Red Hat, OpenStack, as well as Samsung, ASOCs, and others, where we're taking third-party applications and running them on Azure to provide network services to carriers. And then finally, we expose that as a set of programming interfaces up to the assets we have in terms of mixed reality, HoloLens, Teams collaboration, our IoT Central and our IoT Hub, as well as the xCloud Gaming, to give the carriers content that they can take to their end customer. In the end, this is all done in service of the operator community. So essentially, we provide this entire stack up to the communication service providers in concert with all of our partners, whether they be on the radio access side, the packet core side, the OSS and BSS side, to provide that integrated ecosystem the operators need to be successful. So I know that's a very rapid overview of kind of the state of the technology in the industry right now, but this is extremely exciting. You see a number of announcements. Most recently, we announced with Verizon the desire to go to market together with an offer for edge computing, servicing a manufacturing company, ICE Mobility. You've seen previous announcements with AT&T, with Azure Sphere, and our ability to deliver a secure IoT experience with Telstra in terms of our collaboration working on live video analytics. So across the board, we're seeing the intersection of the communication service providers and the hyperscalers to deliver better service outcomes, whether they be to consumers, enterprises, or governments. So with that, I know today's panel is going to be incredibly exciting. There's a lot of implications in terms of the opening up of the RAN, in terms of the ability to make sure that that whole supply chain comes together, where it's secure and controllable. So a lot of issues to work through, and a great set of panelists today that are going to walk through some of the things that will make this vision happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shawn. You know, I've heard cloudification described as something more than the mere virtualization of networks. And I think your presentation really explains how this is something that's more nimble and really able to leverage economies of scale. I'm curious, when it comes to cloudification, how does that sort of play out when it comes to network resiliency? Do you find that there are more challenges to building redundancy and security into these networks than when looking at sort of the cloud and virtualization generally?
Well, so there's definitely a need. So what'll happen is there's a lot, what I say is different challenges, right? So 5G, by virtue of the fact that it's heavily software based, provides a broader attack surface. So there's obviously a lot of things that have to be done in order to make it secure. On the flip side, it provides more tools, right, to combat that. So you've actually got a more sophisticated way of applying policy. You can apply zero trust networking principles between components in the network to minimize the exposure and the impact of anything there. So what I would argue is it's a different set of challenges. On the resiliency side, obviously, cloud-based architectures are designed to be highly resilient, right? They're node-based processing. You use the power of software to move processing around intelligently. So there's a lot more techniques you can use to increase resiliency, but you've got to do it, right? I mean, that's a product of conscious design. It's not just poof, you're in the cloud. But we're very, The cloud experience itself is highly resilient. Applying those same techniques and technologies in the network can drive a resilient network experience. I've experienced with that not just at Microsoft, but in my previous role, I spent 20 years at one of the world's largest operators and deployed virtualized systems. What I do know from that experience is you've got to understand and adopt. You've got to marry together the network processing together with the power of the cloud and the technology itself, and make it and do essentially design in a different way. But once you've designed in a different way, you actually have more options to guarantee the resiliency of the network. Also, the speed at which it heals. And the thing that I think is really exciting here is you can leverage the power of AI and big data to move into a mode not just of reactive failure correction. So in other words, when something fails, you're very quickly able to switch over and correct it. But in fact, to get to the power of predictive analytics that says, hey, if I'm analyzing not just the performance of an individual node in the network, but I'm analyzing the entire network, I can see things that are predictive indicators of failure and start to automatically automate around that in advance. So you actually move your time frame from reacting, it used to be how fast could you react when something failed to can you react instantly. Now you're going into a mode where you're predicting into the future of a potential failure and routing forward in advance. So ultimately, I think you're going to end up with more secure and more resilient networks as a result of this, because they'll be self-optimizing, self-healing, and self-defending.
That makes sense. And then one question before I know I have to let you go, but I wanted to ask, sort of from your perspective, what are the key challenges to deploying this technology? I know you had mentioned during your presentation some of the coordination challenges that are really inherent in trying to connect with different parties and really integrate these systems.
So really, I think there's three ways in which we see people, the three big areas in which people change is one, just basic people skills in terms of, for this to be successful, you want to move to an agile software-based development model, which means it changes the way you think. You tend to deploy smaller, faster iterations of code and software on the network in order to be able to get these capabilities out, test which work, test which don't. When I say that, I mean from a commercial perspective, not an execution perspective, and really engage the entire developer community, because the value to the network comes from people's ability to build on top of it as a platform. So it's changing to that agile software-based methodology of thinking. It changes your engineering mindset, just the way we just talked about, in terms of rather than focusing on predictive causative analysis of failure, you're going to, you're looking more correlation analysis and looking at preventative failure techniques to the way that you engineer stuff. And I think that's a big change for the way that people think through engineering, big change in the way that people think through servicing. And then it's, finally just bringing the people, rightly so, in order to operate networks at scale, operators have developed a very distinct culture in terms of the way they execute, and that's great. Some of that, learning these new skills in terms of the security skills, the virtualization skills, to really take advantage of the technology and then embed that operationally, is a transition. And I think for the operator community is in the process of recognizing that, figuring out how to upskill and retrain their people to a different methodology. And to address some of the issues you mentioned, the security, the resiliency, et cetera. So those are the three areas that I really see people. It changes the way you engineer, it changes the way you develop the network, and it changes the way you build software and services or products on the network.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Shawn. I think this is actually a perfect segue to go ahead and invite our panelists to turn on their video feeds. And Shawn, again, I appreciate your presentation and sort of walking us through. I think that was the perfect kickoff for what's going to be what I imagine a very robust discussion from the rest of the group. Let me please introduce my panelists in no particular order. I'm going from left to right on my screen here. I have joined with me today Yih-Choung, who's the Group Director for Strategy and Research at Ofcom. I have Adam Candeub, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. I also have with us today Jared Carlson, Vice President, Government Affairs and Public Policy, North America at Ericsson, and Dr. Robert Pepper, Head of Global Connectivity and Policy and Planning at Facebook. At this time, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to go ahead and give sort of brief opening statements, 3 to 5 minutes each. Yih-Choung, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, good morning, I think, or in my case, it's definitely good afternoon. I wanted to start by giving you a quick sense of the situation here in the UK. The UK government completed its telecom supply chain review in 2019, supplementing those findings at the beginning of this year. This has essentially led to 3 decisions. First, the introduction of a new set of telecoms security requirements. This is now being debated in the UK Parliament. And Ofcom will have a role in compliance and enforcement, working closely with our National Cybersecurity Centre. Secondly, excluding high-risk vendors such as Huawei from 5G networks. This, of course, has been the noisiest part of the decisions and means network operators, in some cases, will be removing existing equipment and changing plans for future deployments. And of course, they need to do that at the same time that they continue to compete to lead in the deployment of 5G in the UK, which was the first country in Europe for all mobile operators to launch 5G. And in the short term, it also exacerbates the challenge of being reliant on a smaller number of vendors, notably Ericsson and Nokia. And third, diversifying the vendor supply chain. So in the longer term, the answer to these concerns are, I think, very much driving a more diverse and competitive supply base for telecoms networks, rather than having to impose intrusive regulation or intervene after the fact. And the UK government's Telecoms Diversification Task Force, which we've been advising technically, published its 5G supply chain diversification strategy just last week. As the UK's telecoms regulator, even absent the government supply chain review, the extent of market concentration for network equipment is a concern. And we want to see a more vibrant, functioning market, which would deliver benefits to consumers in terms of choice, quality, and innovation in services. And of course, the situation in the UK is not unique, but rather a challenge that many countries face. So it's for that reason that we're exploring Open RAN, a means of promoting interoperability and lowering barriers to entry in order to support vendor diversification and market competition. Now, I'm conscious that Open RAN can mean different things to different people. As a regulator, we're not looking to promote particular technologies or implementation, but rather we're focused on the principle of interoperability. Open RAN enables disaggregation of the radio access network, or RAN, functionality with open interfaces. Now, we might have a slide which, if we can put it up, shows a simplified comparison between a traditional RAN deployment at the top and an Open RAN deployment underneath. And you'll notice that Open RAN allows a broader mix of suppliers to play to their strengths, targeting a given disaggregated element, perhaps radios or antennas or baseband units, rather than having to supply the whole lot. It also facilitates other architectural changes, such as virtualization, the moving of previously hardware-based functions into software, as we were just hearing from Shawn, and edge computing, again, opening up opportunities for new players to participate. But Open RAN is not without its challenges. By themselves, interoperable interfaces are not sufficient. We've seen that in the past with open mobile standards such as CPRI, Common Public Radio Interface, which didn't deliver true interoperability. And we therefore need to work hard through careful planned and specified test beds and a common interpretation of standards to get this to work in practice. I think we can take that in the slide. So what are the next steps for us? Well, deployments such as Rakuten's 5G network using NEC equipment in Japan are very encouraging. But the challenge for existing UK mobile networks and elsewhere is the need to integrate with legacy networks and incumbent vendor equipment. As the industry regulator, we're looking at mapping out the scenarios for migration to a multi-vendor environment, analyzing the sufficiency of standards and industry agreements, and examining the security risks of Open RAN. But we're also getting involved practically. So just last week, we announced the launch of our Smart RAN Open Network Interoperability Centre, or SONIC. This is a joint programme backed by the UK government, led by Ofcom in partnership with Digital Catapult, a technology accelerator, to create a platform for existing and emerging suppliers to come together to test and demonstrate interoperable solutions with standards organisations such as ETSI and the Open RAN Alliance. And beyond the UK, we're very conscious that this is a global challenge where scale economies are critical in a global market. Estimates put the UK at just 2% of suppliers' global revenues. So we need to work closely with like-minded regulators, governments and industry bodies internationally. The IIC has been a brilliant forum for over 50 years, bringing together precisely these parties to discuss and shape the policy agenda in telecoms. So it's a privilege to join you today, and I very much look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Yih-Choung. It's a privilege to have you. Now jumping from the UK to the US, Adam?
Hello. Well, thank you so much, Madeleine. I really appreciate this. It's a pleasure to be here, and these are precisely the kind of conversations that we need in order to build a more resilient communications infrastructure. At NTIA, the agency that I lead, we make it our business to talk with technology stakeholders of every stripe, business leaders, governments, engineers, security experts, and even the occasional hacker. That's because resiliency is not just a technical or engineering problem or a policy problem or policy related to business plans or profitability. It's all of this together, and we need an integrated approach to figure out what's the best way to address these problems. So when it comes to developing next generation standards, next gen standards, or securing the supply chain, or whatever communication goal we have, through our work, we're able to build a more holistic understanding of the problems and hopefully bring our expertise from the government to help industry at large. And then we know our goals can only be achieved with deep and thorough cooperation with industry and our international partners. So let me briefly share NTIA's vision for a more resilient infrastructure and how we've been working to increase collaboration across sectors and disciplines. First, NTIA has been providing key support for the United States government's efforts to protect the nation's ICT supply chain from unacceptable risks and improve transparency so that companies big and small can make better decisions about potential risks that are posed to their supply chain and to their networks. This includes a number of steps to mitigate the threat posed by Huawei and other foreign communications equipment providers. But there is much, much more to do. That's why the administration is seeking to promote open architecture and vendor diversity as part of our overall vision for building out secure 5G networks. We've heard from industry that they are eager to build and deploy open and interoperable networks, and we're very encouraged by our feedback because that's one of the concrete ways we can achieve better vendor diversity and further reduce reliance on untrustworthy equipment that could introduce security and other types of threats to our networks. While the move toward open architecture can and should be industry-led, we believe at NTIA that we can enable, we can be a platform to help build competitive markets, to help coordinate among the many network industries working in these networks. At NTIA, we see an opportunity to work with industry and international partners to develop principles on how governments can provide this support. These principles would seek to advance in the following key priorities. First, these principles would examine how to, in fact, foster vendor diversity and infrastructure resilience to ensure competitive open markets. Second, these standards would examine and discuss the need for rapid innovation and network evolution, collaborative design, and transparent components, while ensuring at the same time interoperability. Third, the principles would discuss the need for international cooperation in the transition to open networks, given the interconnected and cross-border nature of 5G networks and security, and indeed communications today. This could involve coordination and cooperation on both testing and research, as well as development. We look forward to continuing to collaborate with private sector in this effort. As I talk about the importance of international collaboration, I do not want to close. I want to close by mentioning a potential threat to global internet governance. The United States has long advocated for an open, interconnected global internet that enables information to flow freely across borders. As part of that, we welcome China and other adversarial nations into the global institutions that set standards and govern how the internet works around the world. But China has not worked within these institutions in good faith. Instead, they have made massive investments in promoting their vision of nation-state-led governance, in addition to flooding the global market with cheap and insecure technology. As a result, the threat of a bifurcated internet, the threat which has been looming for the last 30 years, and which we have worked so hard to avoid, is becoming ever present, a Damocles sword. We know that the global markets are still important for commerce and for national security purposes. So we have to do what we can do to keep the global system working and fight against existential threats from China. But if a bifurcated internet is unavoidable, the global community needs to work together for that plan as well, so that we can continue working together for a vital and valuable network for, well, the entire planet. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam. We'll transition now from government perspectives to industry. Pepper?
Thank you. This has been really great, and I appreciate the invitation to participate with IIC. It's as Yih-Choung points out, it's a great convener. They do this year after year. I thought that Shawn's presentation was absolutely great and on point, followed by Yih-Choung in terms of what is happening in the UK. I think it's also part of, and building on what Shawn said, what we are seeing is a global trend, but it's also a technology trend, analogous to the trend that we saw starting about a decade ago on core networks, moving from physical and hardware to virtual and software with the software-defined networks. We're now beginning to see that across every layer of the telecommunications networks. And RAN, open radio access networks, is the entry point for many of these discussions initially. 5G is the hot topic for everybody. And so when we're talking about 5G, and then also both what UK and Yih-Choung and Adam talking about in terms of how to replace untrusted equipment, the conversation about vendor diversity, new suppliers, opening up the supply chain, and a secure supply chain has really driven the discussion, starting with the radio access network. But the broader trend, which Shawn talked about, is disaggregated technologies. We've seen this with the creation of the Telecom Infra project, that today, it started in 2016 with about 20 companies. It's now over 500 companies. It's completely global. There are 11 working groups working on products. There are 4 different solutions groups working on things ranging not just from Open RAN, and without the work there by some of the major operators, global operators like Vodafone and Telefonica, working with new OEMs as well as existing ones. We would not be as far along with Open RAN as we have today, but it's also working on solutions like Open Optical, Open Wi-Fi, reducing CapEx and OpEx. And interestingly, when TIP, the Telecom Infra project, was created 4.5 years ago, Nokia was one of the founding board members, even though, of course, it is one of the traditional suppliers. This is a trend that is happening globally, and I think that move from physical to virtual, from hardware to software, across each layer of the networking stack, as Shawn so well described, is the trend. The question is, number one, how do we manage that and make it easier for both existing players? I mean, my friend Jared at Ericsson works for one of the best, technology companies in the world, right? And it's always difficult making transitions from old models to new models. But that's where, different companies are working together in this transition that we're seeing. From an operator perspective, operators want the best of breed for their technology at each layer of the stack. And the way that's done is, and the core principle behind this movement towards disaggregated technologies are standardized, open, interoperable interfaces for software to hardware, as well as across layers, whether it's software to software and hardware to hardware. And this is what is enabling, this new trend. And Open RAN is the tip of the iceberg, the entry point for that conversation, and the product development, the technology development, and the ecosystem development, which is really powerful. This is what's happening. And there are things that policymakers and governments can do. Helped create with other members back in May, an organization that started in the US, but it's global, called the Open RAN Policy Coalition. We started with about 30 members. We now have 57 or 58 from around the world. And we've identified various things that policymakers can do to help accelerate and make sustainable this trend for both Open RAN technologies, but also the broader disaggregated technologies. One of them, by the way, is sort of stimulating demand. Government and in terms of procurement. Importantly, many of the things that the UK is doing that we heard about in terms of coordinating internationally, aligning regulation with objectives, technical collaboration, test beds, open test bed centers. There's a whole range of activities that governments can do and that are doing to facilitate this trend, and also help new entrants as well as existing players get over the hump. The last point is that this is really about creating an entirely new ecosystem for the global supply chain for networking equipment. And one of the fundamental changes in that process is that network operators are at the table at the specification and design stage, as well as the testing stage, with TIP, what we call community labs and open testing. And by the way, we have them, in the US. And Adam, I think you're familiar with these, and you've, heard about these. And Yih-Choung, you're very familiar with the work, for example, in the UK. And this is a fundamental change in the global supply chain for networking equipment that will make it more open, more secure, more competitive, and more innovative, and lower both OpEx and CapEx and OpEx costs.
Thank you, Pepper. Jared?
Thanks, Pepper. And thank you, Madeleine, and for IIC, and thanks for inviting me here today. I think it's quite auspicious that you'll be having this panel on the very day that the C-band auction is beginning, which is likely to be the largest spectrum auction in history. Let me step back a little bit and set the stage. We do this all the time for 5G. And let me start with the 4G story. And if you look at recent history, if you go back to 4G in the US, it supported 20 million jobs, contributed about $700 billion to the economy, and fully 10% of the increase in GDP from 2011 to 2019 was due to the growth of the US wireless industry. And so for 5G, if you look at our most recent mobility report that just came out a couple weeks ago, Ericsson, sees a number of huge impacts across the world and across the U.S. $500 billion of U.S. domestic product will be attributed to 5G deployment. 3 million jobs added to the U.S. economy, and globally, an impact of $13.2 trillion by 2035 as a result of 5G deployments. Around the world, there are 100 5G deployments about right now, and Ericsson is powering close to 70 of those across 5 continents. We think there'll be about 220 million 5G subscriptions by the year end. This is globally. And then by 2026, 3.5 billion 5G users worldwide. And 5G will have 60% population coverage, again, by the end of 2026. That will make it the fastest wireless generation to implement ever in the history of the Gs, and requires us, frankly, to act with a sense of urgency. As people or enterprises are beginning to experience the benefits of 5G for the first time. For example, in South Korea, 5G is delivering content in gaming, ultra-high resolution video, augmented and virtual reality applications. And in the US, I'm proud to report that industries are starting to bring 5G to life, and I'll start with our own. Our 5G-enabled smart factory in Texas is using autonomous robots and augmented reality to redefine our manufacturing process. And I'm happy to say that we've delivered our first base stations manufactured in the US to US customers. So we do see a real need in the US to speed things up and build out our platform. And frankly, this is because, when we see that, when you look at the list of firsts, US was the first to launch 5G back in 2018, first to launch it across low, medium, and high band spectrums. But I hate to say it, that we've actually fallen behind in 5G globally, if we look at where the US is. And so the number one job that we see it is to access more mid-band spectrum and fast. And hopefully today we'll get to, we'll start to see some of that. That's the quickest path mid-band is to both coverage and capacity. Zoning and permitting are also crucial. In the US, there are about 45,000 different jurisdictions that can have a say in the tower process. And then having an actual workforce, a tower climbing workforce, becomes the next bottleneck if you have all this spectrum and you've sped up the permitting process. So another one I do want to talk briefly about, because we've, and I think we'll talk more about this in the discussion, is the topic of RAN and virtual RAN and CloudRAN and Open RAN and various flavors of RAN. Current 5G market momentum around the world is based on 3GPP native 5G RAN architecture. So far, it's been the foundation for 5G success. In the future, 3GPP and ORAN, as we see it, will coexist, and they will share, and already do share, a number of key technological features. And at the same time, they both complement and compete with each other. Right now, current ORAN specifications and off-the-shelf hardware simply cannot achieve the same performance and cost ratio as existing networks can. Over time, the situation will certainly evolve, and ORAN could become a viable complement to existing networks. We don't anticipate that happening overnight. I think we all agree that there's a fair amount of work to be done. And to that end, I'm happy to announce that just at the end of October, we announced Ericsson's CloudRAN. It's a cloud-native software solution handling compute functionality in the RAN. It adds more versatility to network build-outs and can address a variety of 5G use cases. And it's software-based, designed to run on third-party commercial off-the-shelf hardware, and also architected to run as a service in the cloud, whether it be the operator's own private cloud or a public cloud provider such as Azure, who we heard about today, or Google or Amazon Web Services. It brings together many of the benefits of cloud services, including openness, vendor diversity, but it also provides additional advantages over ORAN, such as automation, web scale, and security to further enhance customer experiences and drive innovation. So with that, thank you for having me today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. You've all given us a lot to unpack. So I'm actually going to pick up right where we left off with Shawn discussing the cloudification of communications networks. And Jared, you just started to touch on this in your opening statements about how Ericsson, as you mentioned, recently announced their own CloudRAN portfolio. I'm wondering if you could expand a little on some of those use cases, how you see them changing the markets, and of course, any regulatory or policy challenges you anticipate to deployment. I know we heard from Shawn talking about coordination challenges. I wonder if you share his views or have additional thoughts.
Sorry, is that for Adam or for me?
Sorry, that was for you, Jared. Did I say Adam?
Sure. Let me point to a specific area of CloudRAN I think is interesting and part of a whole RAN discussion, and that is one concept that you have in networks today is the intelligent controller. And if you look to see where where cloudification can shine and where it has some limitations, it's that aspect to how you actually control a radio base station. And some things can be done in near real time, and those really do lend themselves today for a lot of cloud-based solutions. And one example of a near real time event that you can look at would be a first responder responds to an incident. And from some source, whether it's the network or some outside source, that there is this incident, and you're going to need to provide more bandwidth at that incident. That's a kind of thing that a cloud-based controller could really excel at, going ahead and delivering that kind of connectivity within a matter of seconds. When you get to the real-time stuff, the nitty-gritty, for example, massive MIMO. Massive MIMO takes a huge amount of compute power. When we're talking antenna arrays with 128 or even 256 elements, trying to do that with something that's not on site, that's not a dedicated processor, that doesn't have tons and tons of power provided by GPUs, et cetera, that gets really hard to do. And I'm not saying that won't be something that can be done in the future, but today those kinds of really heavy duty use cases just demand an integrated solution.
Thank you. And sort of continuing on this theme of network evolution, I want to turn to the Open Radio Access Network, or ORAN. Yih-Choung, you did a good job sort of teeing this up in your opening statements. I'm curious, why is ORAN a priority for Ofcom?
Thank you. I think, as I raised, the issue is very much one of how do we drive vendor diversification? How do we, no disrespect to Jared, but we kind of want to see a market where we're not so reliant on just one or two players. And I think Pepper said it out pretty well, that we see it as a mechanism by which you can have different players participating in different bits of the value chain. And you don't necessarily have to achieve that same sort of massive global scale to play a role. And I think that's really interesting in the context of 5G, where, as we've been talking a little bit, it might not just be about national mobile networks, but there may be a degree of local private networks, where we see that in factories with so-called verticals or business-to-business sensor applications. And that might be a great opportunity for smaller companies to play a role in the sort of way that if you have a national operator, the idea of switching out your RAN, that's kind of a big deal and something you need to think very hard about. So it is a lot about trying to address some of the security type concerns and resilience concerns by having a more vibrant marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And so then, on the lines of vendor diversity, I mean, Adam, what are your views on how the government can work with the private sector and international partners alike on this issue of vendor diversity in ORAN?
Well, at NTIA, we're taking the leadership in trying to partner with industry to foster vendor diversity. We're actually started a working group just to address that issue, realizing that this is a question that spans the enormous number of tentacles and powers of the federal government, and requires cooperation and coordination with industry at multiple levels. Certainly, we're not in the business of dictating anything to industry as a general matter. However, I think we can, through the various and quite diverse ways of influence that the government has, and through the promotion of standards like ORAN, that work with industry to create the expectation, to create the standards and protocols that we would expect of a diverse vendor environment to thrive in.
Mm-hmm. And so we've heard from the regulators here. I'm curious, Pepper and Jared, if you have any thoughts on what you view on the industry side as some of the benefits that ORAN offers, as well as potentially any risks of ORAN that we should be considering as we look at policies and ORAN deployment.
Pepper, I'll defer to you. I'll follow.
Yeah, you'll follow. I think we've talked about the real benefits of the Open RAN approach. It's not just the vendor diversity, but it's also, we've seen lower costs. We've seen both on the CapEx and OpEx. I believe it's not a question of, benefits and problems. I think there's some challenges. Some of the challenges, we oftentimes hear, Open RAN is going to be great, but it's not ready yet. Actually, there are scale deployments. It is ready. The question is, and by the way, Vodafone announced, that it's going to have a nationwide deployment of Open RAN as it migrates from 4G to 5G with secure networks in the UK. There are deployments being done in the US, but when you look at large operators like a Vodafone, or in the US, the large operators, AT&T, Verizon, and so on, they have capabilities. They are their own systems integrators in many cases. When it becomes to the smaller operators, one of the challenges is who is going to pull all the bits and pieces together. And so one of the things that we've seen, especially both in terms of membership in TIP, but also membership in the Open RAN Policy Coalition, companies that are systems integrators in adjacent markets like computing, and in both, and also secure computing, for example, for the U.S. government. Some of those companies are working to become systems integrators in the Open RAN and disaggregated technology for the network space, because that is one of the challenges. One of the best systems integrators in the world for networks is Jared's company. I mean, this is, what they do. And so, I think we're going to also see vendor diversity on the systems integration side, with Ericsson continuing to be a global leader on the systems integration side piece. But then other companies, I don't know what their business plans are, but I can tell you that members of the Open RAN Policy Coalition include companies like, Dell and IBM, right? They're interested in building, and as well as other global companies that are part of that, because they're interested in the systems integration piece. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we see, particularly for the smaller operators. But it's, it's here, it's real, it's being deployed. There's scale deployments globally.
So thanks, and violent agreement on a lot of what you said. I think when we talk about diversity, what I find a little bit frustrating is the wrong word, but I find an interesting aspect to this whole discussion is that if you look at the entire 5G, ecosystem, if you start at the phone and go to the tower, go to the transport, go to the backhaul, go to the core, there is a lot of diversity there. I mean, with every step of the way. And as Pepper has said, quite rightly, one of the challenges is bringing it all together. There is a lot of diversity in it. In this one aspect, when we're talking about Open RAN, we're a major player. There are, certainly Samsung is, and as is Nokia, and there are a lot of new players out there. But remember, this is just one aspect of the 5G chain, if you will. So just I urge people to care that, keep that in mind as we become so focused on ORAN as being the end-all be-all solution to whatever problem it is that ails you, that there's a lot more to 5G than just the RAN. And in terms of tough cases, and I think, Pepper, you've hit on one of them. System integration is a tough one. And it is a real challenge. I think that if you look at network performance, I mentioned a little bit about it earlier, which is, if you're trying to, cloudify something, keep in mind that a lot of these, we've looked at it. There's one aspect, like controlling the controller for the base stations. If you're really going to do some heavy duty lifting there, you can have about 9 miles is about the distance the maximum distance that you want to have some sort of off-board computing, in order to get that, 75 microsecond, kind of gold standard that you're looking at for some of the really intense 5G applications out there. And then, frankly, security, I think, is another challenge and opportunity. I fully admit that there are some real opportunities there for transparency. But Ericsson has written a white paper on security that says, basically you can look at it. There's, when you open this up, you sort of by definition create, a new threat surface. You basically, the potential exists to introduce, man-in-the-middle attacks and denial of service attacks. And we're working, and Ericsson's an active member. We chaired 2 working groups at the ORAN Alliance. And we're very active in the ORAN Alliance's, it has a security task force, and we're feeding directly into that because we all have a vested interest in making sure that this stuff works and is secure.
Thank you. I'm definitely want to talk more on security, but before we transition to that, I also want to briefly touch on international standards organizations, and certainly they're going to have and do have and have had a role in bringing everyone to the table and supporting sort of the deployment of ORAN and other network technologies, 5G and more. Adam or Yih-Choung, either question for either of you. Do you have some thoughts on what government's role should be, if any, in supporting standards development, and sort of where you see the opportunities for collaboration with industry and government on standards?
I'll have a quick word, I guess. Yeah, clearly this is a really important part. I think we're very conscious in the UK that we're a pretty small market, certainly compared to the US or the whole of Europe, and therefore to see some progress in these areas requires a degree of long-term international coordination and action. And we've been talking with international vendors, the UK government doing a trial with NEC, as well as obviously working with existing incumbent providers to test and develop products in the UK. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think there is, for us, as I mentioned, both a part around test beds and can we actually see whether some of this stuff will work with existing deployments in a safe environment without necessarily having to deploy that in the live network. But standards is clearly a really important part of it as well. And I guess, as I mentioned, we sort of start from the perspective of, well, what are the principles that we're trying to operate on? I'll be fascinated to hear Adam's perspective, but I think that the question of standards is really interesting because on the one hand, yes, we want to be supportive of those things. Equally, I'm very conscious that sometimes if you go too early with a degree of standardization, that can have counterproductive effects. So, and often it's not the regulator who has the best understanding of what direction to head in. I actually have much more confidence in the industry to have that. So we want to be part of those conversations and support that, but I'd like to be humble about our ability to judge where that goes, whilst obviously wanting to be supportive. But Adam may have more wisdom than I do.
Well, I don't know. I need the wisdom to figure out how the unmute button works. I echo the humility, and I'm trying to, abase myself even further as a regulator when it comes to, dictating the contents of standards. These are very difficult things. You have to get it right, or bad things can result from it. Nonetheless, a priority in the US has been enhancing our leadership in international standards development and adoption. And that really has been to forward our leadership in industry-led open standards. And so that even though certainly NTIA doesn't have the right answer for what the ORAN standard should be in any particular context, we believe that a leadership in international standards bodies that actually promote an industry-led process is really the way to go. I mean, the role of government to support industry is really what we see central in NTIA. And in particular with 5G, we are right now working with industry to build the understanding of how global market forces can impact our infrastructure resiliency, secure and open standards development by a competitive landscape of trusted suppliers is really what we're working toward. We want, as a result or goal of U.S. Leadership in international standards bodies is that, in fact, we want to create not a bigger role for NTIA, but rather a greater role for industry participation in these standards development organizations, as well as greater coordination and collaboration among like-minded countries. It has become clear that such collaboration and coordination is necessary to overcome efforts by non-like-minded to advance national interests ahead of international standards and really what works best, we would think, for the entire global internet community.
Mm-hmm. And then along those lines of harmonization, I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question or two about spectrum harmonization. Certainly, as Jared mentioned, here in the US, today is day one of the 5G spectrum auction that the Federal Communications Commission is holding, which will make available up to 280 megahertz of mid-band spectrum in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band, which is a portion of the C-band. So Jared, I'm curious to hear from you. Are governments making mid-band spectrum available fast enough? And sort of as a follow-up question to that, I understand there's a lot of interest lately around the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz bands, and I'm hoping you can expand on that a little for us.
There is, thanks. Just quickly, I noticed that Pepper wanted to get in a word after Adam. So
I apologize.
Jump in there, and then
Yeah,
I'm happy to talk about spectrum.
No, thanks, Jared. Very, very briefly on this, just on Maddie, on the standards piece, there's sometimes confusion among all of these different groups, and I just think it's like 3GPP sort of is the go-to global standards body for the air interfaces for the 5G. And everybody, that's where everybody goes, right? Then I had mentioned the Telecom Infra Project, which is not a standards body, but it's a technology development group. But then for these interfaces, especially as it relates to the Open RAN technology, that's what the ORAN Alliance is focused on. And so, for example, there's an MOU between TIP and the ORAN Alliance. There's also overlap of membership. Many of the members are members in both, and virtually all of the members of either the ORAN Alliance or TIP also, or the vast majority, participate in 3GPP. So there is this coordination among the different organizations to work together, and all the companies work together on the standards. It's very encouraging to hear both Yih-Choung and Adam, talk about industry-led global standards, not national, and using, sort of the industry-led process. But it's really important that governments help support that. And I just wanted to make that point. And finally, Yih-Choung's point about testing, right? Testing, you have the greatest standards in the world, but unless you actually have the ability to bang on it and test it, and it works, it's not trustworthy. And that's one of the innovations that TIP has brought with its community labs that are open testing, that are shared testing sites by the different players, including, operators that compete in the market, share test beds within 3GPP or within, the various testing with, just hammering on it to make sure it all works together is essential. And that is sort of the output part side of the standards. So I just wanted to make that point, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Jared. And I'll let you.
No, I think those are all good points. And I particularly appreciated your point that that a lot of the overlap in different groups and in participation is really sort of a key point in having that redundancy, right? We talk about redundancy a lot in the infrastructure context, but I think you're right that there's also this component here of redundancy when we talk about the facilitating and of the bringing together different groups and meeting of the minds, and as you said, banging on this stuff and testing it out. And I think redundancy in those processes is important too.
Yeah, thank you for that. So if we want to shift to what's going on today in terms of, a very major part of resiliency and networks, for 5G networks in particular, is having access to enough spectrum that's out there. And really excited about today's auction that begins, or I think has already begun. 280 megahertz of spectrum in key midband, in 3.7, as you said, up to 3.98 gigahertz. Really the sweet spot, if you will, for 5G. If you look at what you get from low bands and what you get from high bands, low bands really about coverage, great for trying to reach people in rural areas. High bands, incredible speeds. And if you look at some of the what our companies in the US have been able to do with spectrum that even a few years ago, we would have been frankly a little bit skeptical that you could make a business out of it, but of course people are, and because the capabilities enables are just stunning in terms of bandwidth and latency. And right smack in the middle, you've got midband spectrum, and it's such a crucial area for combining the best aspects of each. Large channel sizes that can enable gigabit type connections. And kind of reach that you need to get into buildings and to be able to serve non-urban areas. Just such a critical piece from a technology perspective. And then from the other side, going back to talking about standards that we've been discussing, is that it's so crucial for business, not only ours, but the users of the technology, to be able to benefit from the economies of scale that you get by the world, hitting on a few key spectrum bands. And this one, which happens to be, not to get too technical, in this band called N77. So, the 3.7 band is right in the middle of N77, which stretches from 3.3 all the way up to 4.2. That is fast becoming, I think, if you look around the world, what will likely be the global roaming 5G midband spectrum. And so, it's so crucial just not only for you as a individual to be able to roam in other countries seamlessly, but also as equipment manufacturers. And I don't just mean Ericsson, I just mean everybody who's going to make, the sensors and the phones and the industrial automation that's going to take advantage of 5G. Now you can, hopefully not build too many different versions of your device. You can just get away with one of them. So it's hugely important, and couldn't be more excited about it, and look forward to how the auction rolls out. And then you also mentioned more spectrum. So, there's ongoing proceeding going on at the FCC, and huge thanks for NTIA as well for making this become a reality. And that is looking at the spectrum just below what's called the CBRS band. So looking at 3.45, this 100 megahertz of spectrum from 3.45 to 3.55. Which we hope will be, and it's proposed to be very similar to what we have going on in the C-band today. Exclusive use, high power. Hopefully, we'll end up with large-ish channel sizes to enable the kinds of speeds that we would like to see in mid-band. A little bit of a longer project for that spectrum, but still very excited about it. And we'll hopefully, as we move forward with the 280 megahertz of spectrum here in the C-band, another 100 there. You get to the point where we start to catch up, frankly, with where a lot of countries around the world are in terms of mid-band spectrum. We have a dearth of it, but if you can get these two key pieces and some more, this mid-band spectrum picture in the US starts to look a lot more positive.
Mm-hmm. All right, I promised we would talk about security. I'm going to pause for a minute to see if anyone has anything they wanted to add on the spectrum issue before we jump to that important topic. Seeing none, I was going to say we've focused a lot thus far about sort of how to support deployment of innovative networks. I want to pivot a bit here and give some thought about how do we make these networks resilient without sacrificing flexibility. And if I can start with maybe some thoughts from you, Pepper, I was going to say, as we look at network resiliency, security, and ICT supply chain issues, why is it important to keep flexibility at top of mind? Is there really no one-size-fits-all solution here?
No, I actually think that's right. One of the things, again, I work globally. One of the things that I see is that the needs of operators in their environments. When we're talking about network operation and resiliency, one size doesn't fit all, right? We're talking in some cases, in some of the least developed countries, greenfield deployments. Those are relatively easy, right? You can design even with different vendors for different layers. It can be integrated and work seamlessly. On the other hand, when you're doing upgrades or brownfield deployments, there's more things that can go wrong. Certainly until we figure out and have experience doing that. So one of the advantages of having the new approach is about designing resiliency in for different situations and circumstances. I thought Shawn did a very nice job talking about that and talking about the resiliency. And it's something that has to be designed in from the beginning. Fortunately, unlike 15, 20 years ago, where security was an afterthought, security is top of mind by everybody. It is, when you start your design, right, you start with security today and you start with resiliency, right? Networks, traditional fixed networks, we're at 5 nines, wireless and mobile networks, that's really hard to do 5 nines, and maybe it's 2 nines, but quality of service and resiliency and security is being designed in from the beginning, and we have to ensure that. But your point, Maddie, which I think is really important, is there are so many different situations and circumstances. And by the way, even in the U.S., urban versus rural, as I said, greenfield versus brownfield. Is it going to be? And I loved Jared's discussion of low band, ultra high band, and now the mid band, and the different needs and circumstances for each of these, the deployments and use of these bands for the next generation with 5G, diversity of solutions, making sure they work together, I think is the way, is part of this trend that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. And so then with these tenets in mind, Adam, what activities has NTIA undertaken to enhance resiliency in communications infrastructure?
Well, NTIA really has taken a leadership role in the federal government in ensuring secure networks in a variety of different contexts. We've been working on the Secure Networks Act to create a plan that will, as Dr. Pepper pointed out, reach not just urban areas, but also rural areas, and given the tremendous diversity of telephone companies and providers in the United States, trying to create the challenge, reach the challenge of giving the support and technical know-how to these variety of networks who often, facing difficulties in making sure that their networks are secure. We have been working on supply chain security in a variety of different contexts to, for instance, develop better standards and working with industry to develop programs and protocols that can be used and applied in a variety of different contexts. So at NTIA, we see security as an essential goal for the United States networks and global networks. And we're doing our best to sort of get the word out, get information out, and develop the best standards that can be implemented by industry, and to create a platform where industry can implement these standards and create a variety of different sort of mechanisms whereby the enormous diversity of networks in the United States and throughout the world can adopt newer technologies and newer safeguards to ensure security.
Mm-hmm. And then Yih-Choung, in your introductory statements, you talked about Ofcom and their recent work on security requirements. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Yes, of course. So, I think as both Pepper and Adam said, this is increasingly a core issue. And that's something that's very much live for us at the moment, as I said, with legislation going through Parliament right now. And part of that is to apply quite detailed telecom security requirements to the networks in terms of how they manage the security threat. And We've been working very closely with the National Cybersecurity Centre, so that's part of GCHQ, the intelligence services, who have access to a whole lot of information I don't have as to how that works and what we need to put in place. Some of the things that we already do actually as part of this is the testing process we call T-Best, and essentially what happens is we encourage the network to employ a bunch of penetration testers. So, kind of think of them as reformed thieves who will come in and see if they can break into the network. And typically, unfortunately, it turns out to be easier than you think. But we learn lessons from that. And in some sense, you can do all the kind of certification you like that, I got this standard lock and stuck it on my back gate and the rest of it. But if we can demonstrate someone can still break in, at the end of the day, there's an issue there. So we do quite a lot of work in that area. And I think it's increasing. I think, like Pepper, I thought Shawn put it very well. When you think about some of the things that we look to in the future, whether that's virtualization or Open RAN, sure, there's a greater challenge because you've got greater attack surfaces in many respects. But there are also opportunities in terms of it being more open. There's more scrutiny of those interfaces, which allow different bodies to come together a little bit like we see in IT practices, where you'd hope that means that we can actually end up with better solutions to manage some of these challenges.
No, please, Jared.
Thanks, and thanks, and all of these things are spot on. Pepper talked about security being in place from the beginning in 5G networks, and I think that's so crucial. And you also touch on the theme of there not necessarily being one size fits all for security, and couldn't agree more. And one of the nice things about 5G that it enables are network slices, and these slices can take on all sorts of different characteristics, not just speed and latency, but also security. I mean, you can actually have different layers for banks and that need higher levels of security than other users might. There's also been a lot of activity internationally on the topic, and urge people that, to the extent you haven't, look at what the Prague proposals are about. Look at all of these documents that have been prepared to help governments understand where they can play a role in encouraging secure networks and secure suppliers, and really a secure process from the beginning. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on one item. And if there are any congressional staffers out there watching this today, one thing that we can work on quickly in the U.S., and Pepper's laughing and he knows what I'm going to say, is let's go ahead and fund the Secure Networks Act. A lot of money has been allocated, but not yet funded. The FCC is moving forward as quickly as they can, but a lot of customers, and not only want to use Ericsson equipment, but equipment from Open RAN providers as well, from Nokia, from Samsung, are sort of in limbo, waiting to go ahead and take the next step, which is to replace what has been determined to be untrusted equipment with equipment from trusted vendors.
Thanks, Jared. Great point. Absolutely.
Well, we have a little over 7 minutes remaining. I want to sort of touch, before we move from the security issue to my closing thoughts and questions. Adam had mentioned in his opening remarks something about sort of alluding to challenges on the horizon, including potential threats to an open, interconnected global internet. I wanted to ask Adam if you wanted to expand on that a little bit, and how NTIA is looking at these issues, and then give an opportunity for others to weigh in if they have any thoughts on this issue.
Sure. I mean, I think that the push for open standards in 5G are consistent and extend, the open standards that really have proved so powerful in transforming global communications. The internet is largely built upon open standards, and we've been able to create a global internet community because government institutions, in cooperation with industry, have been able to promote these standards on a global basis. And I think, and here at NTIA, we're trying to promote that. I think there would be a tremendous cost, not just to users, but to global economy at large. If we face a balkanization of internet technologies and internet standards, we'll just fewer companies will be able to work with fewer companies, and I think that the great exchange and openness which the internet has provided, and even greater openness and exchanges which it promises, might be threatened. So that's pretty much where NTI stands on those matters.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Adam's absolutely spot on. There's some countries that have for years have been pushing national standards versus global standards, closed versus the open, and I think that this is really essential. One of the things I think we are all watching very carefully and are engaged on not supporting are some of the proposals for a quote new IP to replace TCP/IP with proposals to undercut and replace all of the great work that has been done. The history of creating the internet with the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and replace that with a UN standard that is not open. So I think this is, and by the way, Adam, thank you. I mean, NTI has been a great partner on those issues, and part of the USDEL, and also, in terms of working with other governments, Yih-Choung, the UK, and the Ofcom folks involved in these international discussions on new IP have also been really on top of it, and so this is just one more example of, I think, the type of thing that Adam is referring to.
Thank you. And so then with our remaining time, I want to give everyone an opportunity to provide a few very brief closing thoughts, sort of keeping in line with the theme of the restart agenda. I'll ask you all to reflect on the last year. What did we get right in 2020, and where do we need to focus in 2021? Pepper, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start with. So one of the things that there have been a number of assessments of, with the lockdown, with COVID, work from home, school from home. The question is, could the networks support that, right? With the shifts in traffic, the growth in traffic. The good news is that the networks did great. The internet did great. I mean, the fact is there were a lot of concerns very, very early on. Will our networks be able to support all of this increased traffic and the shift from, mobile to fixed, because people aren't driving to work and so on? The short answer is it worked. There were some, places not in the, in the UK or the US, some parts of the world, but even in the emerging markets, the networks worked like they were supposed to, right? Very, very resilient. That's really, really good news. There's some lessons, I think, to be learned. And the other thing is, going forward, we need to make sure that success with the networks, based on the investment, based on the resiliency, the flexibility, that continues going forward.
Yih-Choung, any brief thoughts?
Yes, just to come in on Pepper's point, actually, what a year. I mean, I haven't worked as hard as this year since, I was a strategy consultant working for operators on 3G mobile auctions, and that was a long time ago. And to Pepper's point, I mean, really crisis stuff at the end of March, early April, as we sought to try and keep UK networks up, with 50% increase in traffic during the daytime, people making mobile to mobile voice calls at home, which caused some problems because they'd forgotten they had a landline. And my positive takeaway is that it was amazing the way the industry came together. And I don't just mean UK networks, but we spoke to streaming firms on the West Coast, to games publishers, CDNs, and we all had a common view about dialing down the bit rates, making sure we could keep everything up and running, and we had that collective sense of purpose. to deliver the outcomes that Pepper refers to. So my takeaway for next year is, when we come together and we know what we're trying to achieve collectively, we can do great things, and I hope we continue that.
Thank you. Adam, I've got less than a minute.
Well, I'll just be very quick. NTIA, one of our entities is FirstNet, which is the public first responder network, and we've been working very hard this year to make sure that our first responders, hospitals and law enforcement have been up to the task because they're having tremendous impositions and strains on the network. And also, just going forward, the C-band spectrum has started today. We're doing our very, very best to provide more spectrum for you all. And that's job one at NTIA.
Thanks. Jared, final word?
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say, I think that's what we've gotten right. It's a good way to end it is getting the U.S. back on track in terms of spectrum. And where I would like to see 2021 echoing the theme of, going back to work in person. It's